Hey solo gamers, thanks for checking out How's It Play Solo. I'm Mac Kern, and today I'm going to be taking a look at Imperial Settlers. A solo variant was included in the original game's rules, and later the developer released some campaign-based additions to those rules online. I'm going to be taking a look at both, but first I'm going to give you a feel for how the game plays with multiple players. Let's take a look. A standard game of Imperial Settlers lasts for 5 rounds, and each of those rounds consists of 4 distinct phases. Before I go over those phases in detail, I'd like to show the difference between the 2 types of cards in the game. You have your own deck of faction cards, so today I'm playing as the Barbarians. You also have the option of playing as the Japanese, the Egyptians, or the Romans. And then each faction also has their own faction board. Each faction is pretty unique. They all play differently. So you have a separate board that corresponds with the faction that you choose. And then, in addition to the faction cards, you have a deck of common cards that can be used by every player. During the first phase of a round, each player gets to draw the top card from their faction deck and add that to their hand. And then you draft cards from the common deck. The way that this works is you draw cards equal to the number of players plus 1, and starting with the first player in turn order, that player chooses 1 card to add to their hand, and then the next player in turn order gets to choose 1. There will always be 1 card remaining. That card gets discarded, and then after that takes place, you do the same thing again, but starting with the player farthest from the start player. So you work your way backwards, kind of like a snake draft. And so the way this works for the phase is that you always get to add 1 faction card and 2 common cards to your hand. The second phase of a round is the production phase. During this phase, you produce goods to use later in the round. At the beginning of the game, your only means of production is your faction board. So when I'm playing as the Barbarians, during the first production phase of the game, I'm only going to produce 5 workers, 1 raised token, and 1 sword. But there are lots of ways to increase your production over the course of the game. One of those ways is through production buildings. So if I had this card built in my civilization during the next production phase and all subsequent production phases while this building is in play, I generate 1 food during each production phase. And also, faction cards all have a good listed on the bottom. And if you make a deal with these goods, which I'll show you how to do later, they also generate goods during the production phase. So if I had this deal in place, then it would generate 1 gold for me each production phase. The third phase of the game is the action phase, and true to its name, this is where most of the action occurs. There's a lot of different things you can do during this phase, but the general structure is that when it's your turn, you can either perform an action or you can pass. Once you pass, you can't perform any more actions for the rest of the phase. However, the phase continues until all players have passed, so you can accomplish a lot of stuff during each action phase. One thing you can do during the action phase is build a location, which basically means to add a card to your civilization. There are 3 types of cards. You have production cards, which get played in the top row of your civilization. You have feature cards, which get played in the middle row of your civilization. And action cards get played in the bottom row of your civilization. Also, the art of the cards matches the art on your faction board. So when you build a common card, it goes to the right of your board. Those cards have grass in the illustration. And faction cards go to the left of your player board. And those cards have terrain that matches the terrain depicted on your faction board. To build a location, you have to pay the cost in the upper left-hand corner of the card. So if I wanted to build this card, I would have to discard 1 wood and 1 food, and then I could put this building into play. A lot of faction buildings have this little house icon in their cost, and what that means is in addition to the 2 wood that I would have to pay to build this card, I also have to discard one of my previously built locations. When you build a production card, you immediately gain the goods that that card produces. So putting this card into play would generate 1 immediate food. A lot of cards also have a building bonus that's generated at the time of that card being built. So actually, if you put this card into play, you would get the 1 food from its production, and you would also get a one-time building bonus of 1 food. Feature cards generally have an ongoing effect that applies as long as that card is in your civilization. So for example, if I build this card, every time I build a red card and the card's color is located on the left, I gain a gold and a victory point, and this actually applies immediately. So I would get that gold and victory point just for building this card, and then each subsequent time that I build a red card. Action cards give you additional actions that you can perform during the action phase, and a lot of times these actions allow you to generate resources of some type or to gain victory points. And unless otherwise noted, these action cards can only be used once per round, and so to mark that, this card, I can spend a worker and a stone to gain 2 victory points. I would leave that worker and that stone on this card until the end of the round to mark that I couldn't use it again. Another action that I can perform during the action phase is making a deal. I can do this with any faction card in my hand. Each one produces a good of some sort, and to make a deal, you have to discard 1 food, no matter what the deal card is producing. So if I discard 1 food to make a deal with this card, it generates a worker for me immediately, and then that's also going to generate the depicted good during each subsequent production phase. Another action you can perform is raising cards, and when you raise cards, you have 2 options. You can raise cards from your hand, or you can raise cards from your opponent's civilization. So if this is my hand, any card that has this raise to gain icon in the upper right hand corner, I can spend 1 sword, 1 raise token, to discard this card and gain the goods depicted on it. So I would gain a worker and a food, and I would discard that card. When you raise your opponent's cards, it works in a similar way, but it takes 2 raise tokens. And so if my opponent had built this card, I could spend 2 raise tokens to gain a wood and a stone. And what happens then is, instead of discarding this card, the opponent would get to turn it over and it would stay face down in their civilization. Additionally, that player who had their card raised would gain 1 wood. And then this card sticks around in their civilization because, as I mentioned earlier, some cards, a lot of faction cards, require that you discard previously built locations to build them. You can discard the face down card, which is called a foundation, to pay for the cost of building those cards. Each faction produces 1 shield during every production phase, and these shields, anytime during your turn, you can place this shield on one of your common locations to increase the raise cost for that location. So during my turn, if I put this on one of my common locations, it would cost my opponents 3 raise tokens to raise that building instead of 2. And this only lasts until the end of the action phase, but I regenerate 1 every production phase. So basically, you can protect one of your buildings every round. As I mentioned earlier, once you have action locations built, you can spend an action during the action phase to activate those buildings. And finally, during the action phase, you can spend 2 workers to gain a wood, stone, food, or a card. And that card can be from your faction deck or from the common deck. And this is an action that can be used multiple times. And when you see this, like on your faction board or on one of your action cards, that means that you can activate it multiple times for 1 action if you want. So I can spend 2 workers to gain a stone, or I could spend 2 workers to gain a food, but also for 1 action I could spend 4 workers to gain a stone and a food. And the action phase continues until everyone passes. Once a player has passed, they're pretty much immune to being targeted. So you can't raise cards for a player that has already passed. You can't use your action cards to steal goods. Anything that would target them, they're immune to once they have passed for the round. The 4th phase is the cleanup phase. So during this phase, you pretty much discard any leftover goods. with the exception of each faction is able to store one type of good for the next round. You also might be able to build cards that allow you to store different goods to carry over into future rounds. But for the most part, if you don't use it, you're going to lose it during the cleanup phase. Also during the cleanup phase, if you have action cards and there are goods sitting on those action cards to mark that you can't use those cards again for the rest of the round, you remove those goods and discard them as well. After the cleanup phase is complete, the first player passes to the left and play continues in that same structure until 5 full rounds of the game have been played, and after that, the player with the most victory points wins. Victory points you can accumulate over the course of the game through various card effects, but every faction card that you have built at the end of the game is worth 2 points, and every common card that you have built at the end of the game is worth 1 point. For the basic solo rules, the biggest change to the game is the addition of this attack deck, and this is used as a way to simulate opponent attacks. So at the beginning of the game, you start with one of these cards face up. Each of these cards shows a good in the top of the card, and these cards represent your opponent's deals over the course of the game. So some cards allow you to mess with your opponent's deals. You might be able to steal them or discard them or something. So this kind of replaces your opponent's deals in the solo game. During the lookout phase, the phase where you draw cards in a solo game, you still draw your one faction card, and then you always draw 4 common cards. You select one of these cards, so you get first choice, and then you randomly set one aside. And then you get to select another one, and the remaining card gets set aside with the first one. And these 2 cards represent your opponent's location during the current round. So you can spend raise tokens to raise these cards and gain the resources. If you raise these cards, instead of getting flipped over and generating wood, they don't do that in the solo game. They just get discarded. So you have these 2 cards that represent your opponent's locations during the round. Production phase happens normally. You just perform that for yourself. The opponent doesn't ever produce anything. The action phase, you perform by yourself. The opponent never takes any actions. After the cleanup phase, the opponent performs an attack. And so this happens twice. And to perform an attack, you flip over the top card of the opponent's attack deck and you place it on top of all the other attack cards that have been played so far. So this card that I revealed shows a worker. So what I have to do is look at all of the cards that I've built and see if any of the raise boxes on those cards have a worker in them. If I've only built one card, it doesn't have a worker, I'm in the clear. So I move to the second attack. So I do the same thing again. And now I've revealed a victory point. So I'm going to look and see. I do have a victory point in the raise box of one of my cards. So then I'm going to look and see, okay, do I have something that has a star, the victory point, and a worker? Well, no, this one does not have a worker on it. So then I look to the next card. Do I have anything that has a star, a victory point, and a wood in the raise box? This one does have a stone and a wood, so the opponent raises this location. I don't get to turn it over and use it as a foundation. I don't get any wood from it. So it plays a little bit differently than in a multiplayer game. I just lose this building. And then I take the 2 attack cards that were involved in this attack and I put them on the very bottom of the attack stack. So they're not removed or anything, they're still there, but it kind of gives a chance at the cards that haven't been used to attack. It allows those to be used in future rounds earlier than it would allow those to be used. After the opponent has attacked, you take any remaining opponent locations from the current round and you set them aside in what's called the opponent's location pile. And from now on, any cards in the location pile, you can't mess with them. You can't raise them. You can't interact with them in any way. So you have a pretty limited window for when you can use those cards. And during the next round, you're gonna again set out 2 cards for the opponent's locations, but you don't have a very wide window to mess around with those cards. At the end of 5 rounds, you add up the number of faction locations that you've built, and you compare that to the number of cards in your opponent's location pile. And you win the game if you have more faction buildings than your opponent has locations. And it's really easy to win this game. I've actually never lost. I've never had less faction buildings than buildings in the opponent's location pile. The real fun of the solo game comes from playing your deck as effectively as you can, and if you do win, you can look up how well you scored according to this reference in the rulebook. I will also say that it's pretty easy, once you know what you're doing, it's pretty easy to score over 80 points in a solo game. But it's still a lot of fun to pull off all the combos in the deck and to play effectively with the threat of your opponent, raising your common cards all the time. The campaign rules, which you have to download and print, change the game quite a bit more. One of the biggest changes is that instead of playing a 5-round game, every campaign game you play only lasts for 4 rounds. Another big change is that every game after the first game of the campaign, you have to roll 2 dice and consult a chart for an event that happens over that game. Events add a rule that only applies during the current game. So if I got this Merchants Guild event, I would be allowed to make 1 deal for free every round. And then they also add an optional quest. It's normally beneficial to complete the quest. This one in particular, if I have 5 deals at the end of the game, I get a victory point for each one. Another change to the campaign game is that you have a border faction. So you select a second faction at the beginning of the campaign, and that faction remains your border faction for the entirety of the campaign. Every production phase, you reveal the top card of the border faction deck, and the only reason this exists is so that you can use that card to make a deal. And that's a pretty big deal because sometimes it's hard to justify using your own faction cards as deals because they're so much better if you just build them. But because you can only use the border faction cards for deals, it's a great way to get some additional goods and resources. At the end of the game, if you win, you get to roll another die and consult another chart to add a province to your civilization. And every province has a trait, so that kind of introduces a new rule. For example, if I added the Misty Mountains to my civilization, my stone would be increased permanently, and I can keep track of that. I have what's called an empire sheet to keep track of my achievements, and you can permanently alter your production. This keeps track of all of my provinces, all of the events that I've gone through already. You can carry victory points over from game to game. Some provinces also have a control cost, so at the end of the game, after you've totaled up your score, you have to pay to maintain all of the provinces that you have control of. A lot of provinces also have an upkeep cost, and this has to be paid during every cleanup phase. So a lot of these require you to discard goods in order to keep control of them. And if you fail to pay one of these during a cleanup phase, you lose that province, and it adds 2 victory points to the control cost of all of your remaining provinces. Finally, after you've paid the control cost for all of your provinces, you can spend victory points to purchase achievements. And these give you benefits in future games. A lot of them affect your production. Some of them shake the rules up a little bit, but they all contribute positively to allow you to perform more powerful effects in your future games. Imperial Settlers works very well as a solo game, and it kind of feels like a beat your own score game to me, which typically I don't get too excited about, and that's because of how easy it is to win against the opponent. But a lot of the fun of Imperial Settlers for me is learning how each faction plays and learning how to maximize my points when playing with that faction. And the solo game maintains that. You can pull off some awesome combos. You do have to kind of play around the opponent's raise actions a little bit. So it's a lot of fun. It's pretty engaging. My biggest complaint about the base game's solo rules is that it kind of starts to get a little repetitive. Once you figure out how to play a deck really efficiently, it kind of starts to feel the same every time you play. And I think that the campaign rules do a great job of shaking that up. You're still, you're playing the same faction throughout the whole campaign. You still don't really have an end goal to work towards, but the way that the rules shake things up really keeps it fresh. And I think even with just the base solo rules, I think that there's a lot of replayability. With the 4 factions in the box, that's a lot of learning about those factions because it's a little hard to get the hang of them all. So I think it works pretty well. I think that the campaign mode is an excellent addition to keep the replayability of the game going strong. And I highly encourage any solo gamers to check this one out.